for joining the discussion on opportunities in skilling and building a future-ready workforce in India. We have a really terrific panel and a wide set of perspectives and deep experience in this area. So I'm going to jump right in. So over 80% of India's graduates are reported unemployable. And Ernst & Young estimates that with technology and automation, 46% of the workforce in India will be in jobs with radically changed skill sets or new jobs that don't exist today by 2022. So this gap is the skill gap and the unemployability issue we have today is going to get worse. So where exactly is the skill gap? And I'd like to start with that question first. And Shravan, if I may start with you, given that
Sure.
Coursera has come out with the Global Skills Index. So how do you see skills changing globally, and how is India stacking up?
Yeah, great question. So Coursera, as you know, is a global learning platform, and we have over 40 million learners on a worldwide basis. And in particular, in India, we have about 4 million learners. We've seen some accelerated growth in terms of the learner base in India over the last year as well. So we added over 1 million learners in the last year. And we just published this Global Skills Index just about a couple of weeks ago. And that essentially incorporates the data from all of the engagement that we're getting on our platform. And it's built around a skills graph, and a graph that really looks at all of the courses. We got over 3,000 courses on our platform. And it kind of goes through all of the competencies and skills that each of these courses teach. And we've also built the graph, like how these skills are interrelated, and then through the assessments that are embedded in these courses. So we have over 80 million assessment questions attempted on an annual basis. And so that has given us an enormous amount of information to kind of think about like skills proficiency. And so we used all of this data, and we built this index on a global basis that includes about 60 different countries. About 7,000 different companies are represented in this index. And in particular, I think where we focused on the skills-wise are the skills that are really involved in sort of this digital transformation. And largely it is because of this accelerated change. We all talked about throughout the conference, bending that human arc. And you can do that through deep transformation from a skill standpoint. And so digital transformation in particular means for us, it's business, technology, and data. And so those are the three main domains that we looked at for each of the countries. And in particular, I think from an India standpoint, the ranking for business was 50. Technology was better in terms of 44. This is around the global ranking. And 51 in data science. And when you can peel the onion there, you can start seeing the differences and specific sort of distinctions you can make, because each of these has a composition of 5 to 6 to 7 skills, right? So that's kind of the way we see it today.
So that seems to substantiate the fact that we do have a skills problem.
That's
we
right.
do have an unemployability problem because of the lack of the right skills, especially in a changing environment.
That's right.
So how does Coursera think about addressing this skills gap, and how do you think about the India market?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, India is our second largest market. And like I said, we grew over 40% last year. So we're seeing some accelerated momentum. And we see a lot of the demand relates to, in terms of what the learners are learning on our platform, is in the data and technology skills. Mm-hmm. I would love to see more business skills and the soft skills participation, because when you think about sort of the influencing, negotiation, communication, leadership, all of these are skills that are required. In particular, in terms of the Indian companies, there are also global companies. And so when you think about that, soft skills are equally important. So from a Coursera platform standpoint, we think about stackable model of education. And I think you talked about a number of different scenarios there. In particular, we think of it as the choice from a learner standpoint to develop the skills has to be something that can be entertained throughout their lifelong journey, right? And so first and foremost, that means they have to have a choice whether I want to develop skill just using a particular course. So it may be a digital marketing course. Or when they like that, they might want to say, well, I want to actually specialize in digital marketing. And so now I'm going to take these 3 or 4 courses that gives me those digital marketing skills. Now let's say I actually like all of this and I want to start pursuing a degree because now it's data-driven digital marketing. And so data science with digital marketing as a degree combination that you could be thinking about. So we look at it as a choice that the learners take and a journey different learners take based on sort of the life stage they're at. And that's kind of the way we look to facilitate on one side. On the other side, we also have over 50 different companies in India that are using Coursera as a platform to transform their own workforce. So one is sort of this consumer learner base, and the other is just looking at the enterprises, what are they doing, and what are the sort of the skills that they are asking their employees to get better at. And there again, we see sort of the business and technology and data as a dominating factor. And so we're combining all of this in helping benchmarking the consumers as well as benchmarking the enterprises in terms of their employees and creating sort of these learner pathways.
So you mentioned that India is Coursera's second largest market. Mm-hmm. What has been your experience in monetizing this market?
Sure. So like I said, first and foremost, our mission is to transform lives through learning. So that's our biggest objective in life. So all courses on Coursera you could go take for free and audit for free. But if you do want to get a certification, if you do want to get peer-graded assessments and reviews, or if you want to get like those degrees, you do have to pay for those on the consumer side. But I think the bigger opportunity that we're seeing right now in terms of monetization mm-hmm. is primarily, I would say, there's tremendous growth we've seen on the enterprise side. We have about 50 customers, Infosys, Tata, Axis, lots of these guys, and then we've grown that business almost 300% year over year. And so that's where we see, I think it's this idea that the future of the work and the future of learning are converging. And to the points that, a number of points that were made earlier, enterprises have to fund the education in terms of the lifelong learning. And that's actually, I think, the paradigm that we're seeing. So that business, in terms of the enterprise model, I think it's really great as such.
So just one last question before we move on.
Just feel like I'm dominating the conversation, but
well, we'll do the same with everyone else too.
Sure.
But I was just curious to understand if India is also your second largest market by revenues, because in general, many businesses have had problems converting users
sure.
to revenues
sure.
in India, especially
sure.
with content.
Correct.
So is that a similar experience you've had?
Yeah, so when I look at like our top 5 countries by learner base, registered learner base, it's US, India, China, Brazil, and Mexico, right? And so monetization definitely follows in terms of US being the top country and then India being the second country.
Interesting. So, Mike, I want to come to you, and if you'd like to tell us a little bit about UpGrad and
Sure.
What is your value proposition to a learner? So who is your learner, and why are they coming to UpGrad?
Sure. So, we are an online higher education company where we provide sort of long-form programs, anywhere between 6 months to 1 year long, and help professionals move up in their career. So, essentially, these are folks with 5 to 10 years into their journey in the experience range, and are now struggling with the skills that they have, and they feel that now they are missing out on those skills areas. So, a large portion of our learners come from the IT ecosystem, the technology ecosystem, where skills are changing very, very rapidly. And the objective of them coming to us is essentially to learn those skills. Now, there are a lot of sort of short form certification that they end up getting, but they do want one deep dive sort of program which allows them to move up from skill A to skill B. So for us, it's very important that whatever that we offer, there is a tangible change in someone's career. And such that it's not just about learning, but it's about learning which leads to some kind of an outcome. And that's the focus area that we do. Our core sort of differentiation that we focus on and the value proposition that we offer to our learners beyond outcomes is essentially around a very strong hand-holding. Online education faces the challenge of completion rates. We have managed to sort of build an ecosystem where we are ensuring about 90% plus people are completing the program, and most of them are sort of finding transition, and they are seeing return on the investment that they have done. So that's broadly the kind of learner that we are focusing on, and that's been the core TG for us. But over a period of time, we have expanded our presence in the college education ecosystem, where, as you said, that 80% of the learners graduating out of universities are not employable. We are offering our programs to those learners. And finally, the first-time job seeker, where we have an online program with guaranteed jobs, Does the learner comes through the program, does the program with a guaranteed job coming at the end of the day. So those are the two new ecosystems that we are venturing into, but the core focus area is largely working professional with about 10 years of experience.
And you are able to get these professionals to pay for these courses?
Yeah, so that's the, we have managed, one of the key things that we did, which was slightly counterintuitive, is that we wanted to price it at similar levels as, or discounted level to offline programs, but not to the current online program ecosystem. So our average learner ends up paying us about $4,000, which is amongst the premium, one of the topmost pricing that we have managed to achieve in the current sort of Indian online education ecosystem. We have also offered programs which are upwards of $7,000. So I think the thing that we are seeing right now in terms of learners paying is that if they see tangible outcomes, they are willing to pay. If they see it's just about learning and sort of educating them, you have podcasts, you have YouTube to go through. For them, folks may not necessarily pay for content, but folks will pay for structured learning, which could lead to some kind of an outcome for them.
Interesting. So David, would you agree with that read of the Indian consumer? And in general, how do you think of the India market as it compares to, say, the market in the EU or China, since you're in multiple markets?
Yeah, so Degreed is a 7.5-year-old startup. We lifelong learning transcript, help people map their learning journey across the entire ecosystem. And primarily our business model has gone into enterprise to help them map their learning resources with that people are doing in a self-directed way. So taking the outside of the organization learning and marrying it with the inside the organization learning. We started here, and about 3.5 years ago started sort of our international expansion. Went to Australia, Europe, India, and Canada first, and really have found India to be our most successful sort of international expansion so far. We have since also expanded into Pan-Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. But the market, I think, really hungry for skills. You see that both the sort of emerging middle class, you see the upskilling, you see the pressure of the skills gap, you see the 80% in the informal market, that wants to enter the more formal market. There's just a lot of macro trends that have created a really sort of hungry market. We are primarily going in and serving enterprise clients, and so we are already engaging with a fairly educated, skilled sort of base of employees and clients. I think the conversation, though, I would say is sophisticated as we found sort of anywhere. As I've traveled the world, as I've gone to conferences, both HR, L&D, higher education, as I've met with the ministries of education, the conversation is highly sophisticated. The one area I would say right now, India tends to orient its conversations in a fairly one-to-one way of skills to employment or skills to jobs. And what I mean by that is, how do I become an X, a Y, a Z? And what the challenge is that we are seeing people's jobs and industries, the acceleration of how many times I change my job title is accelerating. And so as the Indian market is developing towards job title, it's left a rigidity, sort of a fragility in the adaptability of people's skill sets or how they orient themselves to the market and to employment. In comparison, seeing some other markets just talk about we need sort of broad-based skills. We don't know what jobs are coming. We don't know where our market is going to evolve. We're seeing, shifts. And so I've seen other markets orient differently. I think India right now is very sort of a one-to-one, people to job, how do we get there? And there's pros, but also some cons to that.
Interesting. And so you've now been in India for the last 2-3 years, right?
Yeah.
So have any of your assumptions going in terms of scale and growth changed over that period?
Really, good news is us entering the Indian market was really our most straightforward sort of market to enter. we tend to serve large multinational organizations. I would say the profile of a large multinational organization in India increasingly looks very akin to a large multinational organization headquartered in the US. Like the differences are marginal and pretty small. So the profile, the use cases, the scale, yes, India is a big market and growing, but as we go in to sell into an organization, well, they have 500,000 people and so does the US company. So it's really more, it's been pretty similar. Pricing is the one area that we have an Indian price sheet that we use in that market that is different than we have in other markets. And there's been a few on the edges, what happens when it's an American domiciled company, but our buyer, who's the chief learning officer, actually sits in India? What happens when it's an Indian domiciled company, sometimes procurement sits in India, but they're domiciled elsewhere. It has led to some questions about our price integrity and how we deal with the discrepancies between markets, as it's not always just totally straightforward. But for the most part, we've found it to be a really receptive market, hungry market, and been pretty successful.
Great. So talking about growth and scale, Lohit, I want to come to you. And as one of the largest staffing companies in India, with I think just short of 200,000 people?
300,000
people. How do you think about scaling? How do you go about scaling, or how have you scaled in the corporate market?
So for us, we can still call ourselves an 11-year-old startup in India. That's another fact that we had an IPO about 2.5 years ago, and we're already a unicorn by revenue, by valuation, and all of that. But we continue to have that ecosystem, that mindset of being a startup as if we were born yesterday. To answer your question on how do we go and get that scale, one, in the past 11 years, we've understood India not to be just one country or one market, but a combination of group of states, each having its own federal structure, very similar to how United States of America is. But in a lot of parts, my friends who come from India and who understand India well would figure this out, that when you're dealing with North and when you're dealing with South, it's pretty different. So one, we have a large base of frontline sales personnel that are supported by the 65 offices that we have across the country. The second is that today on the enterprise side, we have already 3,000 plus corporate clientele that we deal with. As you rightly said, that we have an ecosystem of over 300,000 jobs that we've already given. If I take away the ones which are outside of India, which is in 9 other countries that we are, that's only 10,000. That still leaves us with 290,000 jobs that we've got for folks in India across those 3,000 corporate clientele that we have. The entire ecosystem brings a member gets a member kind of a program. So for us, last year we added close to about 100,000 people. It got talked about in the data which the Prime Minister referred to in Parliament when he said, more than 10 million people got a job. Out of that, 100,000 jobs were just given by just one company, that was ours. The overall market is so huge that when you look at India from the perspective of what is available and what can be got, there is simply a 10x scale which is there. So in our focus at the moment, while India has 1.5 million corporates out there, we focus on the top 7,500 which are the listed companies, the 1,500 odd which are the multinational companies which work out of India, and another alike almost close to 9,000 which are neither multinational corporates nor listed companies but have a scale and a size. That still makes it only 15,000 companies that we are going after. Somebody who's on the digital ecosystem, as most of you, the market is actually 1.5 million corporate clients, users, with the market which has almost 1.3 billion population. Yeah. So that's the kind of scale that we've created for ourselves. In the next couple of years is where we are taking that leap from just being an offline provider of jobs to a lot of work that we want to do on the online side, because that's when we can go and start working with the SMEs and the 1.5 million corporates and not just remain restricted to the 15,000 large mega corporates that we're working with today.
Great. How do you train these large numbers of people, and who pays for that? Because training is not something you get paid for directly, right?
Very interesting question that you ask. See, the understanding in India is that for every one job that you come out, there'll be 100 people queuing outside the door, and which in fair measure is true. Recently, the Indian Railways came out with some 1,000 positions that they wanted to fulfill, and 1.5 million applicants were there. And it's not as if that they were paying some $1 million salaries. The salary that they were paying was only $20 per day. So for a $20 per day salary, 1.5 million resumes came in. The challenge that we face today is that the workforce which comes to us not only requires constant intervention in skilling, but the amount of work which is happening there with the corporates is changing. That's number one. Number two, the tenure of jobs is reducing. So while we say that there is a permanent employment or a temporary employment or a flexi employment, and then there is a gig economy, actually there is a confluence or a merger between the two. You don't sometimes realize that which employment was permanent in nature or temporary in nature, and which was actually a task or an assignment. Just very similar to what you do in the US, which is your, the Thanksgiving, Christmas, and that New Year's period. India started to have seasonalities like that 4 to 5 times in a year. Now, if you have to manage hundreds and thousands of people across thousands of clients, and you have to quickly get them in, make them work within those clients for those durations, and then outplace them to other customers and other clients, the amount of dynamics that needs to be created into skilling is just unbelievable. So in the past, when we did this in an offline mechanism, we would particularly go and say that we will have one training day in 90 days. But today the problem is that the customer itself wants that person for 90 days. So who trains that person to get job ready for the next customer or the next job? And the next job and the next customer may not come from exactly the same industry. So what we've recently done is that we used to have our employee self-service app, which caters to the 300,000 population that we have, where they could do all their HR services, they could do all their compensation, their benefits, their taxation and all. We've created a plugin into that of skilling. But I think that's where the larger ecosystem needs to come together. The clientele, the government, the skilling partners like the ones I have on the panel here, and an employability partner like somebody like us. If together an ecosystem is created and you have basic skills which are housed on an app or on an application, whenever the person moves from industry 1 or job 1 to industry 2 or job 2, that person should have just readily available skills to learn within few weeks and get deployed. I think
that's a very interesting point. And I'd like to ask the panelists, this 300,000 people that Lohit is talking about, is that a market that you're interested in? And why or why not? And also, if you are looking to target that market, can you do it with your current product? Sure. Can you do it with your current pricing?
Sure, absolutely. I'll start out with that. I think great points, by the way. To me, I think fundamentally to address sort of the larger scale problem, you have to work on two ends of the spectrum. One is not just in the workplace environment from a learning standpoint, but also start looking at like the progression that they're having throughout their learning journey. So in colleges. So one of the great partnerships that we have here in India is with Manipal University. Mm-hmm. So we think of it as, they're building sort of the future of university. And they've partnered with Coursera to offer all Coursera courses to any student who wants to take them. They have 20,000 students on campus. And so today there's, I think, about 200,000 hours of learning achieved. And a lot of it is they're focused on learning these digital skills. And primarily because Coursera brings together over 190 partners from around the world. And that is 160 top universities. Mm-hmm. And there are about 30 industry partners, to the point that there has to be sort of this convergence of education coming both from the traditional institutions as well as qualified from an employability standpoint. That's kind of the way we look at our platform. So 190 partners have authored these 3,000 plus courses. And so to me, I think that's one part of it, like where you really have to start building the workforce of the future by bringing sort of this real core skills that you need to supplement as you go through your college experience and that sort of the higher ed education experience to supplement that, right? So that's one way to address that. Because part of the issue for me with India is 100 million people are expected to enter the workforce over the next 10 years, like 1 million joining the workforce every month. I think the bigger part of the issue is access to that higher quality education, as you guys talked about earlier. Only 25% of the population has access to some quality of education, not even talking about higher quality education. So that's the fascinating problem. So you cannot solve this problem post they're in the work environment because they're not even getting there. And so you have to fix it early on. The second piece, to me, I think to specifically answer the question, absolutely. I mean, we would love to work with Rohit's company and help transform the 300,000 people in his company. But the way we think about that again is to help the enterprises benchmark their talent. And so this global skills index and the skills graph, we have devised it based on skills by role, by industry. And so if you're any industry, you can take any roles, because you could say I'm a marketer, you need data skills. You could say I'm an accountant, I need data skills, but so there's a pervasive, right? So by skills, by role, by industry, and we can easily create sort of this benchmark for Rohit's company to kind of demonstrate you have all these types of roles with these skills that are missing as it relates to future. The other one you made, which is like very interesting, I think you all made, like in some ways, you have to continuously transform yourself because the world is changing rapidly. Today, it was cloud, mobile cloud, and now AI, and who knows what next. So all those things have to be built into this index. So our goal is to continuously evolve this index and provide sort of that benchmarking and insights into the enterprises. That's when I think you can have like a real mapped, qualified education pathways for any of the employees as well.
Mm-hmm. David, do you have thoughts?
I mean, I think I'd make a big distinction. When we use the word pathways, I think there's a real opportunity here. And there is a distinction, which is education in the past was almost like building a railway. You could pick people up at sort of one stop. You had to build a heavy industrial sort of system, and you could drop them off at one spot. So, and that's akin to saying when the Indian market is orienting sort of one-to-one around jobs, it's, we got to pick up part of the population, we got to move them, and we're going to drop them off as a IT specialist or whatever it might be. And, the future, and as you look in these, as so much of the population shifts, what is the opportunity to leapfrog? And I think what the future looks like, and pathways of the future, is when we use the word pathway, it needs to be our mobile phone, the GPS. Instead of building the railway system, which can pick you up one place and drop you off one other place, it needs to be where in the world are you? What are your skills? Where are you in your development? And pinpoint you. What do you want to become, or what are the opportunities? Pinpoint any other point on a map, and then close the distance between it. And we shouldn't go then build a railway. We don't need to build a university every time we create a combination of two pinpoints. The opportunity to leapfrog is to be able to identify two pinpoints and then be able to identify the digital or more modular sort of resources to close that gap. How do you get there though? Because that sounds great, but that presumes a couple of things. I would say the whole world has really only developed the middle part of that. The democratization has been occurring. And Coursera is getting there. We see Pluralsight with Pluralsight IQ. Degreed has a product. The world is now starting to work on that first problem, pinpointing you, and doing so efficiently, quickly, effectively. But then there's still a third problem, which the world still sort of has to sort out, which is then being able to effectively pinpoint destinations and being able to break it down by skills or competencies or requirements. And for the most part, employers aren't good at it, states aren't good at it, like no one's really gotten good at it yet. And so even if we identify where you are, we're sort of just sending you off in general directions at the moment. And the future, hopefully 5-10 years from now, is pinpoint pathway. And if India can do that, they will be able to leapfrog. I mean, our American system of training and development in higher education is still a fairly railway developed sort of system. So there's an opportunity to sort of leapfrog here.
Yeah. Right.
Sure.
Mine, do you want to weigh in?
No, so I think to your specific question, yes, we would love to. I mean, that's the reason why I started with UpGraph. I mean, the whole thought process was, if you're not doing it at scale, then what's the point? And right now, I think a lot of what sort of we spoke about, honestly, at least what I spoke about, was a very first world problem. And when we are targeting folks at Infosys, and that's where we launched this program, which I mentioned about the guaranteed job. Now, these are very different kind of individuals. These guys have graduated from college, and they don't have jobs, and they sit for government examination for 3 to 4 years, hoping against hope that they will make it. But they don't find the job at the end of the day, and these guys are now facing the challenge as to where is the job. And when we offer these programs, there's a lot of unique changes that you need to do, both from pedagogy perspective as well as from financing perspective. On the pedagogical perspective, I think it's less about the way we are used to be taught, coding skills, etc. It becomes a lot about how you communicate, how do you articulate, and doing that online is extremely challenging. And therefore, we have built a platform where people can give out vivas, see their sort of feedback, get sort of feedback from others, and make sure that they are now becoming more ready to sort of go through sales. On the financing scheme, we did a very interesting model where we said that the learner has to pay us about, so the job is close to about $4,000 that you end up getting, annual salary. And the learner has to pay about $100 every month. And by 6th month, they start earning $200. So that the total tuition is covered in the apprenticeship model of the internship model, where the learner starts learning. So between pedagogical innovation and financing innovation is when you truly can reach to this level of scale. And I think financing is somewhat easier to solve. It's the pedagogical part which is tough to solve, because I mean we spoke earlier also, these guys are not going to leave their hometowns and go to a place and study for 1 year in the anticipation that they will find a job.
That's right.
They want to stay at their house. They want to ensure the job is close to their house, and only once they have guarantee that I'll get a job in that period of time, they are willing to move. Thus, the online model with the right pedagogical tool and financing scheme can allow us to sort of target. I mean, 300,000 is, again, I'm just saying that these guys, Quest has built a massively large-scale organization, but 1 million workforce is entering every month, and to get to that level, very different innovations are required in the pedagogy and the online education ecosystem.
And if you add to that million, if I may, so while not only do you have to solve the jobs crisis for the million who are entering into the workplace every month, you also have to look after almost the 80% of the population, which is the informal segment, informal employment, and that's $1 a day wage or maximum $2 a day wage with no social security, no future, no financial inclusion, nothing of the sort. So you've got that, and you've got this problem to take care of. So if you try to say that somebody would just double the budget on education in India, and that will solve the problem of the last 70 odd years, is not going to happen. Which is where this ecosystem of the government, the skilling providers, the tech education companies, and the employers, everybody needs to come together to solve the problem of the past while running a train for this contiguous everyday workforce which is coming out.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great point. And I'd like to ask the panelists, so we talked about the ecosystem, and Lohit mentioned the need for the ecosystem to come together. What do we see as missing in the ecosystem today in India to address the skill gap, and how do you see that sort of evolving?
Should I take that? I think financing is a big one. I mean, if you have to deliver quality education in India, it's tough for folks to end up paying serious amount of money. I mean, we can bring down the cost, but then when you have to do hand-holding, mentoring, feedback, support, grading, etc., it does require a cost. And when we are coming to a market where pricing, as all of us mentioned, is an important element, if you have to take this to scale, how do you build the right kind of financing models, which could be linked to success, could be linked to outcomes, and people are seeing that. And I think there are opportunities of innovating on that front. I think that one piece right now, I still feel there is good progress made by a lot of fintechs coming into the ecosystem and making it better. But I think there's a lot of work still needs to be done in order for us to reach to that sort of specific level.
I mean, I think from my perspective, it's the access. It's so you have great universities based in India. Acceptance rates in IITs is like below 1%, as you put it, 200:1, right? So it's crazy. And so fundamentally, you have great institutions, and so there is real opportunity for even local institutions to kind of embrace the online models much more aggressively, and also just kind of think about how we take all those. There were lots of data points in terms of tier 2 colleges and tier 3 colleges. And that's where sort of the flow of learners are coming through. So you have to go back and kind of figure out like how do we solve that problem at that level to improve the quality. And I think you can't purely rely on the employers ultimately, and it's both ways, but I think that's one big part of it. I think the other big part of it is certainly, I think to your point, 52% of the jobs are at risk of automation, right, according to MGI. So fundamentally, there's this dual ends of the spectrum. So one is the access side, the other is continuous learning and transformation as a recognition by the enterprises. So on stage, President of ASU was talking about their partnership with Starbucks. And so Starbucks is doing it for the greater good, not because they're hoping that I'm putting this employee together this degree program, and so they're just going to stick with us. I think they're looking at this as like really developing the workforce of the future from a global perspective. So now that's challenging. As a profitable for-profit business, it's always hard, but I think you do need to think about sort of a long-term perspective because sort of the turnover is what, like 20%, 25%?
Yeah.
So what goes around comes around. And so if you do good for the employees, they will believe that, yeah, you will improve retention in the short term, but actually you will probably improve the retention in the long term. I think that's another big part of it.
Quickly, I think if what's pulling people out of the sort of the development is money, you really sort of have to solve the money problem. We've seen interesting models begin to emerge. I mean, we've seen sort of boot camps emerge and sort of proliferate. We're just now starting to see these models of earning while learning. And so I think exploring those models and the incarnations of those models that can map back to the Indian market, that's a way, because if that's a problem, you got to help people earn money while learning so that they can continue to participate.
And if I may just add to what David just pointed out, see, it's also a cultural issue with India. So the affluent families, and I think right from yesterday's discussions here and your today's point of view is also, if you're a certain family background, you essentially expect your parents to take care of your education, not till the age of 18 when you can get the first employment, but actually till the age of 22, 24, 25, depending on how much higher education that you want to get into. That has to fundamentally change.
And then you expect the employers to pay for education.
And then the employers to pay for the balance of it. What has to fundamentally change is people need to get out to work when they first legally can, which is 18, then start getting the skills depending on what the industry requires or where the jobs are moving, because the jobs are also so rapidly moving every 5 years. We didn't have a digital economy as far as financial inclusion is concerned, but today there are 800 million transactions in a month happening in India. So from a country which probably didn't use too much of cards, today is doing everything on mobile phone as far as finances is concerned. So that needs to completely get synced. People need to get out to work sooner. They need to use the rest of the 40 years of their employable time and gather skills there.
Right.
I think it's worth saying the answers that we all just gave, if you gave those on a university campus in America right now, you'd get shot. I mean, like, it's worth just pointing out that this is a different conversation than where we're at, and in good ways and bad, but, you know.
Absolutely.
Well, we do partner with 160 universities in the world, so I just want to make sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
we
great.
probably have time for one more question before we invite questions from the audience. What would be your advice for companies that want to enter the India market? And maybe David and Shravan could take this first.
Sure, David.
I think for us, sending our American executives to India has made a really big difference. And so just getting there, embedding, understanding, that's the biggest advice I'd give.
Yeah, I think for us, certainly, Coursera did not have an office in India for a while, and so we have opened an office in Delhi, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And I think the feet on the street has really helped us build those relationships. Today, we, like I said, 300% year-over-year growth in the enterprise sector, all because we have a team on the ground that is really engaged. But I think more importantly, you do need to think about sort of, if you want to incorporate diversity of perspectives and cultural differences and kind of how the learners think, how the enterprises think, and how the regional content plays a role, you have to have sort of that line of thinking when you're going into a market. You can't just take blindly a product that exists somewhere else and just go to another market. I think so that would be my big takeaway.
True, great, thanks. We probably have time for just one or two questions from the audience if someone has a question. There's someone right there at the back.
Hi there, Sally Ann from Gleek. My question would be for those of you degreed, Coursera, in these markets. I mean, we do know the engagement levels on LMS systems, learning systems are very low. I mean, the retention, if you look at, it's less than 10% after a certain period of time. How do you become sticky in these markets, like India, number one? And then if I look at Quest, you know, who I know you have the rights for Monster, India, Asia, etc. You know, how do you create that pipeline of those coming up from the universities when we know in India for a fact, when we talk about brilliant young Indians, we do not talk about soft skills. We do not talk, and regardless of those LMS systems out there, there's no real measure for the workforce to be able to say, this stuff is working, it's available, but we're not using it. So that's my question to you guys.
Should I take one of them?
Sure.
I think we, just on education, I think we achieve a completion rate of 90% plus for our online programs at UpGrad. And our focus, I mean, I just give you a couple of analogy. I mean, education, at least in our context, we always say that it's, I mean, it's like eating spinach. Till your mother slaps you too, you never want to eat on your own. And there is a huge amount of push required. I mean, education is not like Netflix that you will eat and you'll sort of chill out, watch Netflix. It requires a fair amount of push for the learners to go through. And therefore, while learning alone is akin to reading book, and you can read many books and you can drop in the middle, education requires a very strong human support ecosystem to ensure that the engagement is fairly high and people are completing the programs. I think that one bit in India really works if you have a community feel. I mean, we do things like this. I mean, for working professionals, if they are not going through the program, the kids receive a message saying, look, mom and dad are not completing the modules. And there's a pushback, and it's a community that learns together, and that's how we are able to achieve higher completion rates there.
Yeah, I think to add to the point, ultimately it's about the learner outcomes and how really seriously invested yourself. So when we look at our degree program retention, it's over 90%. When we look at people who are paying for content, even, we have geo-pricing in India as an example. The completion rates are over 50, 60%. The enterprise employees, learners are completing at even higher rates. So certainly, I think the incentive mechanism has to be there in terms of like, what's in it for me? And if I invest this time, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months learning, what is the real outcome I'm going to get? Like, is that a promotion? Is that a job? Is that like sort of a reskill myself into a new job? Because I think what we're really talking about is deep skilling. You know, in terms of the micro skilling, like how do I use a pivot table or the vocational training pieces, you can go watch a video, an hour or 30 minutes, you'll get through it, you will get to the next step. But if you really want to transform your life, you have to invest time and energy. And so where we focus on is, what does that learner experience feel like? So all the way from sort of the discovery, which is how do we take the skills and skills graph and create a way that for them to understand, take a quick diagnostic, here's the outcome I want to establish, and so here are sort of the skills that I need to develop, and now it's mapped to very specific courses. So the next wave, of course, you know, we've also invested in AI, ML-based adaptive personalization. Now, there's a long way to go there, clearly, but to the point where it is actually a long journey, you need to be able to say there are other people that you can hold their hand and continue in the journey. So if our AI intervention system says, heads up, 80% of others have had difficulty with this quiz. And so you're not alone in that journey. So things like that, so both technological intervention and some sort of human intervention are going to be a combination that can help you go through that journey. And at the end, I think you've got to be able to advance and showcase. So I've learned all these skills and demonstrate that I actually got these skills through the projects, through the team assignments, through the collaborative things, to the point about soft skills. Put that package together for the learner as you go through that experience. then they can carry that forward to kind of showcase, and from an employability standpoint, they're validated along the way.
Sure, sure. So just looking at the time, I think we're a few minutes over. So if there are further questions, the panelists will, I'm sure, be around and would request you to come up and talk to them. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll
Great
start
panel.
the next panel.